Mark and I first saw Ashwood House on a crisp autumn afternoon. The sunlight, weak and golden, filtered through the skeletal branches of ancient oaks. It cast long, dancing shadows across the overgrown lawn. The house stood on a small rise, proud and dilapidated. Its stone walls were stained with age, and ivy clung to them like a possessive lover. Yet there was a grandeur to it, a solemn beauty that called to us. We had been searching for a project, a place to pour our savings and our sweat, a place to build a future, brick by painstaking brick. Ashwood, with its turrets and wide, staring windows, seemed perfect. It was a challenge, yes, but one we were eager to embrace. We saw past the peeling paint and the boarded-up windows. We saw the home it could become. Our excitement was a tangible thing, a warm bubble protecting us from the chill in the air. Mark squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with the same hopeful light I felt in my own chest. "This is it, Lily," he whispered, his voice full of conviction. "This is our place." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. We imagined roaring fires in the massive hearths, dinner parties in the grand dining room. Our children one day playing in the rambling gardens. The sheer potential of Ashwood House was intoxicating. It was more than just a building, it was the canvas for the life we yearned to create. We were young, full of dreams and perhaps a little naive about the shadows old houses can hold. The solicitor, a dry man with dusty papers, had been quick to finalize the sale. He'd seemed almost relieved to be rid of the property. "Needs a lot of work, that one," he'd said, a statement so obvious it was almost comical. We laughed it off. Work was what we wanted. We craved the ache in our muscles, the satisfaction of seeing something broken made whole again by our own hands. We spent hours drawing up plans, choosing color palettes and arguing playfully over fixtures and fittings. The house was a silent, waiting presence in all our conversations, a third party to our dreams. We were blissfully unaware then of its own ancient, patient desires. Looking back, even in those first heady days, there was a feeling. A faint, almost imperceptible undercurrent beneath the thrill of ownership. It was the way the silence in the empty rooms felt deeper than mere quiet. It was the way shadows seemed to linger a moment too long in the corners, even in broad daylight. Or perhaps it was just the weight of its history, the many lives that had passed within its walls, seeping into the very stone and timber. We told ourselves it was atmosphere, character. We were so eager to romanticize it, to see only the beauty and not the darkness that lay dormant, waiting for us, waiting for me. Our first trip into the nearby village of Oakhaven was for supplies. Paint brushes, plaster, the mundane tools of our grand endeavour. The village itself was quaint, almost unnervingly so, cottages huddled together, their windows like watchful eyes. The people in the general store were polite enough, but their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes when they learned where we were staying. "Ashwood, you say?" Mr. Henderson, the portly shopkeeper, had paused, his hand hovering over the till. A hush had fallen over the other patrons. It was subtle, but I felt it. A sudden tension in the air, a shared unspoken knowledge that excluded us, the outsiders. They knew something about Ashwood House, something they were reluctant to voice. Later, an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, approached us outside the pub. His name was Silas, and his eyes, though faded, held a sharp, knowing glint. "You folks the new owners of the Ashwood place?" he'd asked, his voice raspy. When we confirmed, he shook his head slowly. "That house? It ain't right. Never has been." He told us about the Ashwood family, the original builders. Wealthy, reclusive. They had vanished, he said, over a century ago. One day they were there, the next the house stood empty. No note, no trace, no bodies ever found, just gone, as if the house itself had swallowed them whole. A chill traced its way down my spine, despite the mildness of the day. Mark, ever the pragmatist, had clapped Silas on the shoulder. "Old houses always have their stories, friend," he'd said with a reassuring smile. "Adds to the charm." But Silas hadn't smiled back. "Some stories are best left buried," he'd muttered, turning and shuffling away, leaving us with a lingering sense of unease. I tried to shake it off, to dismiss it as local folklore, the kind of tall tale that clings to any old imposing structure. Yet his words, "swallowed them whole," echoed in my mind. The image was unsettling, a dark seed planted in the fertile ground of my imagination, ready to sprout with the first strange whisper from the house itself. We drove back to Ashwood in a more subdued mood. The house, silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky, seemed more imposing, less welcoming than before. The warnings, the strange silences, the story of the vanished family, they all combined to cast a faint pall over our initial enthusiasm. I told myself it was ridiculous. Houses were just bricks and mortar. They didn't have appetites. They didn't consume their inhabitants. But as we unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the echoing silence of the hall, a cold draught seemed to greet us. A draught that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. It felt like a sigh, ancient and knowing. The first few weeks of renovation were filled with hard work and a determined optimism. We ripped out rotten floorboards, scraped layers of faded wallpaper, and battled cobwebs that seemed to regenerate overnight. The house resisted us in small ways. Tools would vanish from where we'd left them, only to reappear days later in the most unlikely of places. A hammer in the bread box, a screwdriver atop the highest bookshelf. Mark would scratch his head, a frustrated frown creasing his brow. "I could have sworn I left it right here," he'd mutter. I tried to laugh it off, blaming our tiredness, the sheer chaos of the work site, but a small, cold knot would tighten in my stomach each time. Then came the sounds. At night, as we lay exhausted in our makeshift bedroom, the house would come alive. Creaks and groans like an old ship settling. We told ourselves it was the ancient timbers, the wind in the eaves, the house adjusting to our presence. But some sounds were harder to explain. Faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing, that seemed to weave through the walls. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like soft footsteps in the empty corridors above us, or a door gently closing in a distant, unused room. Mark, a heavy sleeper, rarely heard them, or if he did, he dismissed them with a sleepy mumble. "It's just the old place, Lily, go back to sleep." Cold spots began to manifest. Not the general chill of an old, unheated house, but pockets of intense, bone-deep cold that would appear and disappear without reason. One moment I'd be painting a wall, feeling the warmth of the weak sun through the window. The next, an icy presence would envelop me, raising gooseflesh on my arms. I'd shiver, looking around for an open window or a draught, but find nothing. These cold spots seemed to move, to follow. Once I felt one brush pass my cheek in the hallway, like an unseen person sighing cold breath against my skin. I called out, thinking it was Mark, but he was outside, hauling timber from the truck. The unease was a slow-growing vine, twining itself around my thoughts. I started to feel watched. It was a constant, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, especially when I was alone in a room. I'd turn suddenly, expecting to see someone, something, but there was never anything there. Just the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, the silent waiting rooms. Mark noticed my growing anxiety. "You're letting this place get to you," he said, his tone a little sharper than usual. "It's just an old house, Lily. It's got character, that's all." But his reassurances felt hollow, even to him, I suspected. The character of Ashwood House was beginning to feel less charming and more sinister with each passing day. The strange occurrences began to escalate, shedding their subtlety like a snake sheds its skin. It was no longer just creaks and cold spots. One morning I came downstairs to find every cupboard door in the kitchen wide open. Not just ajar, but flung open as if by a violent, unseen hand. I remembered meticulously closing each one the night before. Mark, already at the stove making coffee, just shrugged. "Must have been the wind," he said, not meeting my eyes. But there had been no wind. The night had been still, unnervingly so. A small, insistent voice in my head whispered that the house was playing with us, testing its boundaries, testing me. Shadows, too, became bolder. No longer content to flicker at the edges of my vision, they started to take on more definite, unsettling shapes. I'd catch glimpses of a tall, stooped figure out of the corner of my eye, vanishing when I turned to look. Once, while painting the upstairs landing, I saw a dark shape flow across the far end of the hallway, too quick and too silent to be Mark. My heart hammered against my ribs. I called his name, my voice trembling, but he was downstairs, whistling as he worked on the plumbing. The house felt increasingly crowded, filled with unseen presences that brushed against me in the dark. The whispers grew more distinct. Sometimes I could almost make out words, soft and sibilant like dry leaves skittering across stone. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the very fabric of the house. I started talking back, at first in hushed, fearful tones, then with more anger. "Leave us alone!" I'd shout into the empty rooms, my voice echoing mockingly. Mark found me like this once, yelling at a blank wall in the dining room. The look on his face, a mixture of concern and exasperation, made me feel even more isolated. He didn't understand. He couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge what was happening. My sleep became a battlefield. Nightmares plagued me, vivid and terrifying. Dreams of being trapped in endless shifting corridors within Ashwood, of being chased by something I could never quite see. I'd wake up breathless, drenched in cold sweat, the phantom whispers still echoing in my ears. The lack of sleep frayed my nerves, making me jumpy and irritable. The house was wearing me down, chipping away at my resolve, at my sanity. I felt a creeping dread that Ashwood wasn't just haunted, it was hungry, and it was slowly, methodically, setting its sights on me. The joy we'd felt, the dreams we'd had were fading, replaced by a gnawing fear. Mark began to change. It wasn't sudden, not at first. It was a gradual erosion of the man I loved, like stone worn smooth by a relentless, dark tide. He started spending more and more time in the basement. He claimed he was checking the foundations, dealing with damp patches, but he'd be down there for hours, often late into the night. The basement, with its low ceiling and earthen floor, had always given me the creeps. Now it felt like the malevolent heart of Ashwood House, and Mark was being drawn into its rhythm. His laughter, once so easy and frequent, became a rare sound. When he did emerge from the basement, he was different. His eyes, usually so warm and expressive, seemed distant, clouded. There were dark circles beneath them, not just from lack of sleep, but from something else, something deeper. He grew quiet, withdrawn, often staring off into space, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When I tried to talk to him about the strange things happening, about my fears, he'd become dismissive, even angry. "You're imagining things, Lily," he'd snap, his voice flat, devoid of its usual kindness. "There's nothing wrong with this house. It's all in your head." His words were like little shards of ice, piercing my already fragile composure. One evening, I tiptoed to the basement door, drawn by a low murmur. I pressed my ear against the wood. He was talking. Not to himself, not in the way one does when concentrating on a task. It was a conversation. His voice was low, deferential, almost reverent. I couldn't make out the words clearly, but the tone sent a shiver of pure dread down my spine. There was no reply I could hear, just Mark's hushed monologue, addressed to the darkness below. Who was he talking to? Or perhaps what was he talking to? The thought was terrifying. The man I married was slipping away, replaced by this hollow-eyed stranger who communed with shadows. The distance between us grew into a chasm. We still shared a bed, but he felt miles away, his body cold beside me. The intimacy we once cherished vanished, replaced by a strained silence. I felt utterly alone, trapped in this decaying house with a man I no longer recognized and a presence that grew stronger with each passing day. The house wasn't just affecting me anymore, it was claiming Mark too, or perhaps he was willingly giving himself over to whatever lurked in the suffocating blackness of the basement. The thought filled me with a despair so profound it was almost a physical ache. Ashwood was winning and I was losing everything. Section 6. The basement's call, my own descent into shadow. The feeling of being watched intensified, becoming a constant, oppressive weight. It was in every room, every shadow, every sigh of the old house, but the basement pulsed with it. A palpable malevolence emanated from below, a siren song of dread and decay that both repelled and fascinated me. Mark was spending nearly all his time down there now, emerging only for brief silent meals. His face pale and drawn, his eyes holding a disturbing emptiness. He no longer spoke of renovations, only of listening and understanding what it wants. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I had to see what held him captive. One afternoon, when Mark had uncharacteristically left for the village, muttering something about needing specific tools he couldn't find in the house, I gathered my courage. My hands trembled as I approached the basement door. The air around it was noticeably colder, heavy with a damp, earthy smell, and something else, something sickeningly sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot. I pushed the door open. A gust of frigid air rushed out, carrying with it a faint, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to curl around my name. Lie. It seemed to sigh, drawing me forward. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against the silence. The stairs creaked ominously under my weight as I descended into the oppressive gloom. A single bare bulb hung from a low beam, casting weak, dancing shadows that writhed like living things. The basement was larger than I remembered, a labyrinth of stone supports and forgotten junk. Dust lay thick on everything, disturbed only by Mark's recent footprints leading deeper into the darkness. The silence here was different, not empty, but full, as if holding its breath. I followed his tracks, my own footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the packed earth floor. The air grew colder, the silence more profound the further I ventured. In the furthest corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old, rotted crates, I saw it. A section of the stone foundation wall that looked wrong. The stones were looser, the mortar newer in places, as if it had been disturbed or repaired relatively recently. But it was more than that. It looked like a crude attempt to seal something off. A pile of rubble lay at its base, broken stones, dried mortar, evidence of recent activity. Mark's activity. This was where he spent his hours. This was what he listened to. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my resolve. Something was hidden behind that wall, something ancient and terrible. Section 7. The hidden well unearthing Ashwood's dark heart. A compulsion stronger than fear gripped me. Perhaps it was the house itself guiding my hands, or perhaps it was a desperate, last-ditch effort to understand the madness that had enveloped our lives. My fingers, numb with cold and apprehension, began to pick at the loose stones in the wall. They came away surprisingly easily, crumbling in my grasp. Dust filled the air, choking me, but I barely noticed. I worked with a frantic energy, pulling away rocks, scraping at the loose mortar, driven by an unseen force. The silence of the basement pressed in, broken only by my ragged breathing and the scrape of stone against stone. More stones came loose, revealing a dark cavity behind them. The rubble I was creating piled up around my feet. The air that seeped from the growing opening was colder still, carrying an ancient, musty odor, like air trapped for centuries. It was the smell of deep earth, of decay, and of something else, something indefinably evil. My muscles ached, my hands were raw and bleeding, but I couldn't stop. I was unearthing something that had been deliberately hidden, sealed away for a very good reason. And with every stone I removed, the oppressive atmosphere in the basement seemed to thicken, to grow heavier, more menacing. The house was watching, waiting. Finally, with a last desperate heave, I pulled away a large, flat stone. It thudded to the earthen floor, sending up a cloud of acrid dust. I peered into the darkness beyond. It wasn't a cave-in, not solid earth as I might have expected. It was an opening, a perfectly circular man-made void disappearing into the blackness below. A well, an old stone well, its mouth roughly sealed, not just by the wall I had dismantled, but by a massive, intricately carved stone slab that lay horizontally, covering the abyss like a monstrous manhole cover. The carvings were strange, unsettling symbols I didn't recognize, worn smooth by time. A profound sense of dread washed over me, so potent it nearly buckled my knees. This was it. This was the heart of Ashwood House. This was the source of the whispers, the cold spots, the encroaching madness. The well radiated an ancient, patient malevolence, a hunger that seemed to draw the very light from the dim bulb above. I could feel it, a psychic pressure building in my skull, a silent scream emanating from the depths. Whatever was down there, it was old, it was powerful. And by uncovering its seal, I had done something terrible, something irreversible. The air vibrated with a silent, terrible anticipation. Section 8. Awakening the Ancient, the Truth from Below. A faint sound. At first I thought it was the blood rushing in my ears, a trick of the strained silence. But then it came again, louder this time. Scratching. A dry, rasping sound like claws dragging across stone, coming from beneath the heavy carved slab that sealed the well. My breath hitched in my throat. The sound was rhythmic, persistent, growing in intensity. Whatever was trapped below was aware, it was awake, and it was trying to get out. The temperature in the basement plummeted, and the sickly sweet smell intensified, now mixed with something else, something like metallic rust, like old blood. The massive stone slab, which must have weighed hundreds of pounds, began to vibrate. Tiny pebbles and dust danced on its surface. Then, with a low, grating groan that seemed to shake the very foundations of Ashwood House, it shifted, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to reveal a sliver of utter blackness at its edge. A puff of foul air, colder than a grave, billowed out from the gap, carrying with it a chorus of faint whispering voices. a cacophony of despair and ancient hunger. They weren't just in my head anymore, they were real, they were here, and they were calling my name, promising oblivion. In that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, the truth about the Ashwood family crashed into my mind with the force of a physical blow. Not a story, not a legend, but a horrifying, stark reality. They hadn't just vanished, they hadn't run away, they had been fed to the well, sacrificed, appeased, generation after generation, perhaps bound by some unspeakable pact to keep the thing below sated. And when the sacrifices stopped, the house itself, or the entity it served, grew restless. It needed to be fed, it always needed to be fed. The whispers, the shadows, the manipulation of Mark, it had all been a prelude, a way to prepare the next offering. The scratching stopped. A new sound emerged from the growing gap beneath the slab. A wet, tearing sound followed by a low, guttural exhalation like something immense and ancient, drawing its first breath in centuries. The slab tilted further, scraping loudly against the well's stone lip. It was coming, clawing its way up from the Stygian depths where it had festered for untold eons. I was frozen, a trapped animal staring into the eyes of its predator. I understood now. The house didn't just want to scare me. It wanted to consume me. It wanted to add my essence to the chorus of suffering that echoed from the abyss below. Section 9, Consumed by the Dark, My Inevitable End. It's beautiful, isn't it, Lily? Mark's voice, calm and cold, sliced through my terror. I whirled around. He stood at the foot of the basement stairs, a grotesque silhouette against the dim light from the hallway, but it wasn't Mark, not anymore. His eyes were no longer clouded. They were abyssal pits reflecting no light, only an ancient alien intelligence. A serene, terrible smile stretched his lips, a smile that did not belong on his face. He looked rested, revitalized, as if he had finally found his purpose. He held one of the specific tools he'd gone to fetch, a rusty antique sickle, its curved blade gleaming faintly. "It's been waiting for so long," he continued, his voice a soft croon echoing the whispers from the well. "It's so very hungry. And you, Lily, you're the one who opened the door. You've set it free, you've prepared the feast." He took a step towards me, the sickle held loosely at his side, but with an air of deadly intent. The thing in the well, the entity he now served, had him completely. He was its instrument, its willing acolyte. My screams caught in my throat, a choked, silent gasp. There was no escape. The basement was a tomb, and he was its keeper. The love I had felt for him was a distant, painful memory, extinguished by the all-consuming darkness of Ashwood House. The stone slab covering the well slid aside completely with a final deafening crash. A wave of unimaginable cold and a stench that choked the air with its primordial foulness erupted from the black maw. I didn't dare look directly, but from the corner of my eye, I saw them. Not hands, not claws, but something far worse. Glistening black tendrils, impossibly long and thin, tipped with needle-sharp points, uncoiled from the darkness. They moved with a horrifying, fluid grace, questing, tasting the air. They were followed by a glimpse of something vast and ancient, a being of pure shadow and insatiable hunger, its form shifting and indistinct, yet utterly terrifying. My final scream was a raw animal sound, swallowed by the oppressive darkness and the triumphant chorus of whispers that now filled the basement, echoing from the depths of the well and from Mark's smiling lips. The tendrils reached for me, cold as death, strong as iron. I felt a searing pain as they wrapped around my ankles, my wrists, pulling me inexorably towards the gaping void. Mark watched, his face alight with a terrifying, ecstatic devotion. Ashwood House had claimed another soul. The cycle would continue. The hunger would be sated for now. My last conscious thought was of the endless, cold darkness waiting below, and the whispers promising an eternity of torment.